Yeah, no, getting Pankatrops is nuts. Like, this, I don't know, like, having an extra thing to Foolish that, like, actually gives you a progressive play instead of, like, doing, like, a Metal Plus Fusion or something when you have nothing else is really nice, and Pankatrops is pretty decently strong, so it was definitely worth it.
What's B2? Capital G here, talking about a newly discovered spicy tech engine that emerged at YCS Chicago over the weekend. In this video, we're just going to break down that engine, explain what it is, what the applications for the engine are, why it's actually seeing play, and then talk about how good it actually is, because low-key, I feel like it is something that moving forward for the rest of the format, you need to be able to identify, because you could end up running into it, or you might want to have the knowledge because you might actually want to run it yourself. So what you guys just saw was Elise Davis, a duelist who actually made top 32 at YCS Chicago over the weekend. She played a very interesting going second version of Sky Striker, and she ran a very unique build, something that I definitely had never seen before, but it included a very interesting engine, and that engine included Foolish Burial Goods, Dino Wrestler Prankatrops, and then a lone copy of World Dino Wrestling. And this is actually the field spell for the Dino Wrestler archetype. And I'm just going to go ahead and read World Dino Wrestling just so that everybody knows exactly what it does, because there may be some people who are unfamiliar with the card. Heck, if you don't watch Yu-Gi-Oh! Vrains, you may have never even heard of this card. It's a field spell, as I said before, and it says while you control a Dino Wrestler monster, each player can only attack with one monster during each battle phase. If your Dino Wrestler monster attacks an opponent's monster, it gains 200 attack during damage calculation only. If your opponent controls more monsters than you do, you can banish this card from your graveyard, special summon one Dino Wrestler monster from your deck. You can only use this effect of World Dino Wrestling once per turn. So it's an interesting card, and obviously its best applications are in its own archetype, but you look at the card and you might be a little confused on how exactly this engine works. You might be thinking, okay, Cap, so is the point of the card to kind of slow the duel down where both players are only attacking with one monster? Is it to get your Pankatrops a little stronger, give it 200 attack? It's actually none of that. It's very similar to something like Luna Light Serenade Dance, where you're actually only going to be using one part of this card's effect, and it's the part that activates in the graveyard that can summon a Dino Wrestler monster from your deck. Now, the monster that you're going to be summoning in almost every situation is going to be Dino Wrestler Prankatrops. The only time that this would actually vary is if you're running this engine in a Dinosaur variant, in which you could hypothetically summon other Dino Wrestler monsters that could be more useful than Prankatrops in any given situation. However, if you're just splashing this into, a multitude of decks that aren't dinosaur related, the only card that you're going to be running, the only monster anyways, is Prankatrops, because it is by far and away the best monster in that entire archetype, and it gives you the most utility, and it's by far the most flexible card in the archetype. So that's the one you want to stick to. And if it wasn't obvious by now, the way that you're getting your Dino Wrestling in the graveyard is with the aid of Foolish Burial Goods. So let's talk about some of the applications and why you should consider it. The first thing that I have to acknowledge is if you can only really play this engine if you are running a go second deck. And the thing about that is you might think, okay, Cap G, well, who really wants to go second right now? But when you really look at the top cut of YCS Chicago, if you guys watched a lot of the deck profiles, you'll know that about 8 of the players who were in the top 32 said that they blinded second in every single duel. And the interesting thing was, not only was it Rafael Nevin who won the entire event with Luna Lights, but you also had the Cyber Dragon player in top 8. You had Calvin Tahan and his ABC going second build in top 4. A lot of the go second players were incredibly successful. Elise Davis, who, we talked about earlier, who, I kind of discovered this entire engine from, was playing a go second version of Sky Striker, and you do have to go second to get the maximum amount of utility from this engine, simply because for you to resolve this effect, your opponent has to have a monster, at least one monster on the board. So if you're going first, you can't really use this engine. But the reason that the engine is so solid is because it allows you to get a colossal size monster on the field. Prankatrops is 2600 attack, if I'm not mistaken, and it's not just a monster that can beat over one of your opponent's monsters, but the reason Prankatrops sees so much play right now is because it has the ability to blow up a card on your opponent's side of the field. This can be anything from randomly set back row like Widow Anchors and Solemn Strikes, being able to get rid of those cards, so you now have the confidence to summon your more important monsters without them having to, worry about falling to those cards. It can also also be Floodgates, which are definitely still in the meta. If you guys saw those top Guru controlled decks, they were running things like There Can Only Be One and Goes in Match and other Floodgate cards in the main deck. Obviously, Altergeist are known to play multiple Floodgates, or it can even be a big monster your opponent has on their field that you don't have the ability to easily out. The fact that you can get Prankatrop straight from your deck, and one of the most important things is you do not have to use your normal summon. That is one of the most appealing things about this, is the fact that you get Prankatrops, a card that can remove multiple threats on your opponent's side of the field, but it doesn't come at the sacrifice of your core engine. You can still get your normal summon off, you can still naturally progress through your plays without really sacrificing what your deck inherently wants to do. And the cool thing about it is, if you're running Foolish Burial Goods already, it really isn't something where you have to sacrifice all that much, because it really only requires you to run just a couple of additional cards, maybe even as small or maybe even as little as one additional card. Another cool application with this engine is the fact that it gives you another way of easily dealing with the dreaded turn 1 Azathoth combo. You guys know right now that's hard drawing Prankatrops gives you a way of dealing with it as well, because you can special summon it in your main phase using your turn player priority. Your opponent tries to chain the rank up, you just chain your Prankatrops, you pop their target, and then it basically fizzles. Well, even if your opponent does chain the rank up card to the copy of Foolish Burial Goods and locks you out of monsters, they think they've won the duel, but actually they haven't. All you got to do is summon your Prankatrops, you attack into their Azathoths, and then your opponent's in a situation where, yeah, you haven't been able to use monster effects for that turn. However, as soon as their turn comes by, you can just pop one of their monsters during their battle phase, and there's almost no way they're going to be able to OTK you. A lot of those OTKs are done with Boral Sword Dragon, but your opponent obviously can't drop Boral Sword Dragon with you having Prankatrops on the field. Otherwise, you'll pop it. Even if your opponent tries to activate some type of effect that would clear your Prankatrops, you can just chain it and you can pop their copy of Rusty Bardiche, and there's probably not going to be a good chance of them OTKing you at that point. One of the things that I asked myself immediately is, what happens if you actually hard draw the copy of World Dino Wrestling? I was like, there has to be some big drawback to this engine. You're only running one copy of it. Well, what if you actually draw it? Then you're basically just screwed, right? You can't activate the card because it's not in your graveyard. How are you going to get it there? But then I really thought about this format, and I was like, man, I think it's kind of easy to get cards out of your hand, or at least it's easier now than it has been in, so many different past eras of Yu-Gi-Oh! Look at the meta right now. Look at some of the commonly played cards, and then think about all the ways that you can discard cards from your hand. You will realize there are a ton of them. Obviously, there's Twin Twisters, and Twin Twisters with this card is absolutely nuts, because think about this, right? Let's say you're running into a Sky Striker deck, or you're playing against an Ultra guy, some deck that wants to put a bunch of like set cards. You do realize that if you Twin Twister discarding your World Dino Wrestling, you actually get to pop 2 cards on your opponent's side of the field. You get to pop the 2 spells and traps. Then you can banish, you can summon your Prankatrops, you can attack over one of their monsters, and then you can pop another card with Prankatrops effect. You can basically Twin Twister your opponent, and in the end, get rid of 4 cards on their side of the field. So this card is actually quite nuts if you hard draw it and you discard it for Twin Twister. It can also be used obviously with the Danger archetype, and let's be real, Dangers are basically everywhere right now. So if you do hard draw it, there's no problem. Maybe you end up discarding it with a Danger and getting it into the graveyard that way. And then lastly, you don't even really have to main deck any answers to get it out of your hand, because who isn't playing the Nightmare cards at this point? I mean, there's Nightmare Phoenix and Cerberus and Unicorn. You can just go into any one of those, you can discard it for that, get your utility effect, draw a card potentially, and then at the same time summon a Prankatrops to give you a little more offense or a little more utility. So even if you don't happen to hit this card off Foolish Burial Goods and you do hard draws, right now in Yu-Gi-Oh! There are simply enough ways to get it out of your hand because we have discarding everywhere in the format. And that kind of leads me into my last point about this card, and that's where you can actually use it. Obviously, we already talked about Sky Striker, but let's also look at a deck like Luna Lights. It's gonna sound surprising, guys, but Raphael Navin, if you looked at his deck list, not only was he running the Dangers, but he was running 3 copies of Prankatrops in his main deck. So he really doesn't have to adjust anything because Lunalights are also a deck that has run multiple copies of Foolish Burial Goods for a long time, mainly because they want to be able to get the Lunalight perfume in the graveyard, and when Serenade Dance came out, that was just pretty much the icing on the cake. At that point, Foolish Burial Goods became staple in Lunalights, and Lunalights also run the dangers, so if you're playing a Lunalight build, if you guys just want to net deck Raphael Navan, or you want to run a deck that's similar to his, he basically only needs to add one card into his deck, and he can run the full Dino Wrestler package. And really, if you're just running any deck that naturally uses Foolish Burial Goods, Cubics is another one where I think it's a prime contender. Cubics are a deck that, like the OTK with the Crimson Nova, this can give you a 2600 monster, make it a little easier to OTK. You're already running goods anyways, just start making your Cubic deck go second. But I feel like there is a ton of utility in here, and even if you don't run Foolish Burial Goods, you could still run this in a go second build and just use the utility of the Prankatrops, and then if you do happen to draw your one copy of your World Dino Wrestling, you can just discard it for like Twin Twister or something like that, and I don't think it should happen really all that much. But what do you guys think of this engine? Leave it in the comment section below. I think it's pretty nifty, and it's something that I would definitely consider running if I was going second. Thank you guys for watching. As always, subscribe if you have not already, and turn on that notification bell for daily videos.